Hello again, Snyder fans. We meet again as I review the latest Zack Snyder film, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. This is a sequel to the film that came out December of 2023, Rebel Moon Part 1. I don't remember it's Part 1, A Child of Fire. I'm glad I had that note because I did not remember that off the top of my head. I reviewed this movie back in December to a lot of you having thoughts and problems with my review. What I say to that is, I don't care. Cry in my comments. Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. So let's talk. Hello again, Snyder fans. My name is Ben Friedman, film critic, and today I am reviewing Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. This is a direct sequel to Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. This movie came out in December 2023. Rebel Moon Part 2 just came out this past weekend. I got the chance to review and well, hello, we meet again, Snyder fans. My name is Ben Friedman, film critic, and today I am reviewing the latest Zack Snyder Netflix film, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, a sequel to the December 2023 film, Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. If you saw that review on this channel, which a lot of you did, I strongly disliked Part 1. I thought the movie was pretty atrociously bad. In fact, it even made one of my top 10 worst films of 2023. I think it made it even within the top 6. So that kind of tells you how I felt about that movie. And I'm a big Zack Snyder fan, so that was a disappointment to me. Going into Rebel Moon Part 2, I had no expectations. I legitimately was like, am I even going to do a review and talk about this movie? Because I'm probably just going to hate on it and just be a little mean-spirited about it, and I didn't want to do that going into this review, especially because I know Zack Snyder has a very loyal fan base, which, again, I would consider myself a Zack Snyder fan. So what was I going to do? What was I going to do? That was the big question with this review. But to review a film, you have to watch a film first, so I put on Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, this morning. I put it on and sat down and watched it, and immediately I was kind of taken with this film because there is actual qualities of this film that I want to talk about just off the bat. Like, there are qualities in this film that I will just fully say right now were not present within Part 1. And I'm not going to go into any great detail pretending like I remember what happened in Part 1. I did not revisit it. I did not read a summary. I just was like, okay, there's some sort of war going on. People are fighting, good versus bad. I should be able to kind of just jump in. And I did. I mean, I didn't know who these characters really were. I didn't remember much about them. I remembered some of the actors. Djmpn Hounsou, I horribly mispronounced that name, but the main actor in this film, Ray Fisher, Sofia Boutella. I remembered some of the main actors in this movie, so I was like, let's jump into... I remembered the main actors in this film, so knew just kind of broadly where their stories ended in Part 1. But right off the bat with Rebel Moon Part 2, what I noticed there was a scale to this movie that I felt in this one far more than I felt it in Part 1. Part 1 I thought was just really bad world building almost for the entirety, to the point that I just didn't think much happened in Part 1. Part 2 is not that. It is far more, not character driven per se, but it is seemingly focusing more on just a few characters, allowing these actors to give slightly better performances. I think everyone is better in this movie than they were in Part 1. Maybe it's just because now that we've gotten some of the world building out of the way, you can just focus entirely on the characters. That helped it in its favor, especially the leader of this group, played by Hounsou, I believe is his name. He plays Titus in this movie. He's really good. He's really good and everything. So I noticed the scale of this movie already started off better than it did in Part 1. And that was kind of just my whole vibe throughout the film. Everything as I was watching it, I was just like, okay, this is slightly more competently done than it was in part one. I think the performances are all better. I think the special effects are a little bit more grounded and look better. I think the villains actually have some intensity to them. And so while watching it, that was kind of my repeating factor. I'm like, okay, part one wasn't very good, but part two, I'm at least vibing with. And vibing with is kind of the key, because I would not call this movie, Rebel Moon Part 2, a good movie. I still think it's very fundamentally flawed. I think the characters are paper thin. I think this world is just poorly built. And I think this movie relies so heavily on cliches. But if you're talking about just kind of watching it on the background, having it on and enjoying it, I certainly can say there's some fun moments within this movie, and certainly scenes that I felt like lived more up to the pedigree of which I put Zack Snyder in. The biggest issue that Zack Snyder has always had as a filmmaker is he works better when he is adapting material rather than writing his own source material. When I think of his DC run, I just think of the aspects of Batman versus Superman that work really well, where I feel like they are largely pulled from the comics. And then other aspects of that movie where it falls apart, it's where it no longer feels faithful to the comics. So he is able to adapt source material and even change it in a way that is interesting. When he's completely working within his own world and own tendencies, I think he becomes a little too grandiose for his own good. And that is one of the issues that I found with Netflix with this Zack Snyder relationship. Zack Snyder is essentially a filmmaker who's been given the liberty to do whatever he wants on screen, and he's given no limits, and there's no pushback on him. So he falls back into all of his worst tendencies. This film is overly long. It is overly stylized. It far relies too much on some of his slow-mo action scenes, and it's just a utilization of actors continuing on that I just don't think he is able to get the best performances out of. So all those aspects are present within this Zack Snyder film. So it does give you that within the Zack Snyder context. What it also does give you as a Zack Snyder fan is some of the excitement, some of the imagination of how to visualize an action scene. There are moments of that throughout where you understand that this guy could fundamentally make interesting and revolutionary art. It's just that it is so juxtaposed to the other aspect of him. Zack Snyder is such a wonderful visual storyteller. I think that has always been one of his talents, and yet his storytelling sensibilities always get in the way of Zack Snyder. So what I would hope to see after Rebel Moon Part 2, now that he's gotten this out of his system, and to be honest, we might just be in a world where Zack Snyder just continues to pump these movies out for Netflix. My guess, if he is actually being greenlit for Part 3, Part 4, these movies have to be doing semi-successfully on Netflix. But if he can escape the Rebel Moon trajectory of his career and actually go back to more, I guess, either, if not IP-focused storytelling, but more studio-centric filmmaking, then I believe there is a path forward for him. And I would want to see him work with screenwriters who essentially write the material. That way Zack Snyder himself doesn't have to write it. I'm not necessarily saying that Zack Snyder should have no input on the story. If he wants a story credit, if he even wants a co-screenwriting credit, all power to him. It is just as a sole filmmaker and author of this text, it just doesn't fully work. And that's the biggest issue. Rebel Moon is a big swing, and it's one that does not connect. And unfortunately, I don't know if it ever had the ability to connect because it is allowing Zack Snyder to indulge in his worst tendencies as a filmmaker. With that all said, like I said, there are really good action sequences in here. There is far more excitement I found in the pacing, the tone. There's just more fun to be had while watching this movie. Maybe it's because it's a little bit more war-centric, so it allows Snyder to really just dive into his action filmmaking, which again, I think is probably one of his strongest points. But it just doesn't go anywhere, and I think this franchise is essentially a lost cause for me. I don't ever foresee this being the next big thing. And I don't ever foresee this being what I want out of Zack Snyder as a filmmaker. So I hope he can pivot in his career, because this did give me at least a little bit of hope that the filmmaker who made Dawn of the Dead, the one who made something so revolutionary, even if I don't love this film in 300, the guy who just can put such incredible visual storytelling into characters. What he does with Man of Steel, I've always said Man of Steel is incredibly underrated and deserves to be taken with more fairly. I think that movie is unfairly maligned for some of its decisions, especially in the third act. I think if you strip it to its core, I think there's a really beautiful movie in there about humanity and a God's existence within that humanity. He is able as a filmmaker to do the grandiose and bring a certain level of authenticity and sincereness to it. In Rebel Moon, it's just unfortunately lacking. And I hope that this is not where we find Zack Snyder for the next 10 years, because my fear for him is that he has the Michael Bay Transformers route, where the next 10 years is just going to be Rebel Moon movies. And then everyone just kind of starts getting to the point where, oh, well, Zack Snyder's washed. He just can't make anything interesting anymore. He's just so focused on this Rebel Moon project of his, and he'll never get back to it. And then it takes us a few years to get Michael Bay back into his quality. That's what I fear could happen to Zack Snyder. And I don't want to see it, because when Zack Snyder hits for me, I think he hits like nobody else. And there is a certain adrenaline and excitement I feel when I see Zack Snyder compose a shot. And that's when I want to see more from him. So that's my review for Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Can't recommend it, but if you like the first Rebel Moon movie, this is certainly an improvement. I'm going semi-kind with this review. I'm going 2 out of 5 stars for Rebel Moon, which I know some people are like, that doesn't seem like a very nice review. I gave Rebel Moon Part 1, if I'm correct, half a star. So this is showing an improvement. So do keep that in mind. Anyway, thank you all for watching this video. Please be nice to me in the comments. And if you like this video, please make sure to subscribe for more.